So the actual weathering process has been pretty basic on these in terms of my methods for pigment and powder application. Mostly the rust is going to be concentrated around the ends and around areas where the trucks are. You guys pretty much know that by now. But the interesting thing with these cars is because of the mounting points on the containers here, the centerpiece, there's usually a lot of grime and runoff that comes from the containers that usually will streak down, and you'll have prominent little streaks of rust and things that kind of accumulate around the center of the car. These spines are pretty unique in the way they weather, and I wanted to demonstrate that real quick. So what I wanted to do was actually show you guys some of the weathering processes that I'm using on this. For one thing, I like to use a larger brush to just knock the trucks out real quick. I don't want to spend a lot of time doing the trucks just because this car is really hard to handle, being that there's not really any real good points to grab. But you can see I just put the dark brown pigment on the trucks, and then same thing on the end truck there. I just pretty much will apply some of that, trying not to waste powder, but I'll go in there and then I'll start slowly working into the area around that mounting pad there. And then what I'd like to do is take up a liner brush. I'll come back in with some of that, and there's usually going to be a lot of grime buildup. This is the same kind of weathering that you see on spine cars in intermodal service. Usually there's going to be a lot of this grime that comes in here. It sprays in from the wheels and goes sort of aft of the truck, and it sprays up onto pretty much the entire car body. And so with these spine cars being smaller, a lot of that spray will usually gather all the way down that whole beam. So what I like to do is just kind of fan it out. Obviously some of these are cleaner than others, but I just go in there and just build up that grime like that. Now what I'm going to do is come in and start adding some different dimensions of color. Now I'm going to switch to a dark rust. I'm going to start hitting little areas like the little mounting pad there. There's going to be some rust streaking. I'll just take a fine brush. I could use a micro brush for this too. And I'm just going to start doing just some little rust streaks. Just here and there. Think of all the runoff again that's going to be coming from those containers. Think about all that's going to be streaking down. There's generally going to be a lot of sludge, garbage juice, and things like that that runs down from these containers because they usually are full of moisture, and obviously the moisture running down creates all kinds of fun little slips of juice and things like that. But yeah, a car like this definitely provides a lot of possibilities. So now I'm switching up to a much lighter, fresher rust, and I'm going to start concentrating some of that around that mounting pad, as I said, because that's going to be an area where a lot of that rust and grime will gather up. You'll get a lot of garbage juice and things like that. I'm going to kind of spread it down the pad like that. At the top of the pad, I'm going to also apply quite a bit of this, and then I can move to another liner brush again, give me a heavier application because I wasn't liking that effect. And now I can blend that out and then keep kind of stretching that down the side of the car body. Back to this other end here. Same process, just go in and basically just apply a little bit of your pigment right to the base around that truck and just spread it out like that. Do a little bit lighter application on this end, just give me that variety. And just make it look nice and dirty. Just like that. There's a lot of pigment in that truck, so I'll kind of knock some of that down and start applying that on the area of the coupler. Get some of that out of there. There we go. I'm just going to keep working that in. And now I'll take a little bit of the bright red. I like to hit the top of the journal, generally on these wheels, because that's going to be an area where you see a lot of that white rust. And also up here, just streak some of that down around that jacking pad. Put a little there. Just some little highlights, right? Little areas of highlight to enhance some of that. In terms of the weathering on the deck, I'm not worried about this too much because obviously this is going to be covered with containers. So once the containers are on there, you're not really going to see that. So that's not too much of a worry. But at this point, if you wanted to weather up your deck and do a little bit of grime work and things like that, you of course can. For a car like this, any spine car really. But I'm pretty much going to leave it there. So I got that one side done, and I'm going to repeat the same process. I'm going to detail out these trucks a little bit more, and then I'm also going to go back and add a little bit of mud splatter. That's going to be the next crucial thing because, as I said, there's a lot of garbage juice splatter, and essentially things like that that just get all over these cars and just cake them with mud. I'm taking a little bit of pale gray acrylic, and this is just diluted with water and a liner brush. And I'm going to take a little bit of this and start splattering it down the car body. I'm going to splatter some on the truck first, like this. And I'm just going to apply this in small increments just here and there. I'm not going to go too heavy, but obviously you can, because some of these cars do really get caked in mud. But for this one, I'm just going to do kind of a lighter application, and I'm just going to work down the car body. The process is pretty quick. You just got to keep loading up your paint. And if it starts to kind of dry out, you just gradually add a little bit more water to it. And then you just, again, transfer it to the model, spread it out like that. Just get some different little effects doing it that way. So you can see it builds up around the truck, builds up around the base. And as it starts to dry, you'll get a little bit more of a blend where the paint starts to set up on the car body. It'll start to kind of saturate into the powder work a little bit, dry out, and you get this really cool effect like that. So it looks like old mud splatter and a fresh mud splatter kind of mixed together. Again, it's all over the truck, just like the prototypes have it. So it's a pretty convincing effect, but it's actually a key feature I found in all of these cars related to the trash industry, because they just get so much mud on these. Well, the flat cars are done, and the first set of containers are all weathered up, and you can see I've done some really fun weathering work on these to replicate some of the patching areas where the cars were retouched up. All the decals are on. You can see there's all kinds of funky little bits of weathering, lots of mud splatter. So I think they all turned out really good, and I'm really happy with the results. Obviously you can still see the texture, but to be honest, once they're weathered up, they blend in quite well. So I'm actually happy how these turned out. Definitely worth it. So the next thing we actually got to do to finish these containers is model the tarps, and I talked about this briefly. What I'm going to actually be using to do this is going to be using some black tape. And the reason I've chosen black tape is because it's self-adhesive, so I can stick these on there and they'll be able to fit, and because I wouldn't have to try to use any kind of like rubber or pantyhose type material or something like that where it's a little bit more complicated to cut. This I can basically stretch out in a large sheet, and then I can cut the tarps to size relatively easily. Plus, they'll stick on the car. I can weather them very simply, dull coat them, and actually put some decals on them when I show you guys that in a little while. So that's going to be the solution there. And I'm not going to show the process because it's going to be, I kind of need to be like all hands on deck for this whole thing. Basically what I'm going to do is I'm going to use the large 2-inch black roll of tape. And by the way, you can find these on Amazon. They're real cheap. It's like I think like $6 a roll, a set of these. I'm going to use one of these to stretch out. I'm going to put it on my board here basically, clean it up obviously, and then I'm going to cut out the tarps to fit over the sides, and I'm going to also fit out the tarps for the ends that wrap around, and I'll fit those on, and then I'll weather them up, and I'll show you guys what all the tarps look like once they're on. But it's actually pretty genius. I'm kind of honestly surprised I never thought of this before, but it's a pretty good idea, so I'm going to definitely try it out and we'll see what it looks like. Right, so I basically figured out how I'm going to do this. I have a set of tape here. I have a 2-inch roll and a 1-inch roll. The 1-inch roll I'm going to use to do the long tarp that runs basically the length of the container. You can see it wraps onto the end very well, and it looks great actually. It fits right on there. It'll look better with weathering. So 1-inch roll to do the long tarp, 2-inch roll cut to size to do the long wrapping tarp that'll come around and meet on both sides. To start, what I'm going to do is the main long strip, and you can see I've basically cut a section, and I'm roughly cutting these to the length you see here. It's just a little under 3 inches, so that's a pretty easily way to replicate that. So about basically a 3-inch cut here, and I'm just going to take a strip of tape like this, and I'm going to keep pulling it out and just keep measuring 3 inches apart, and I'll just keep cutting a couple strips until I have enough strips to do all the containers. Pretty simple. Process is pretty much as simple as you think it would be. I just cut the strips out to size, and then I just take them and transfer them over to the container, and then I transfer it over and just line it up equally spaced on both ends like that. And it needs a little bit of work. Hang on here. Let's see. It's pretty good. Okay, there we go. And you just press it down. Like I said, this tape has some pretty good tack, which is good. And I just pretty much will fold it on the end like that. But I actually really like the texture as well, because it actually does look like a big rubber tarp. So that's a plus. Again, it'll look way better once it's weathered. And then the last one here. Just line that up. Put a little tape on there. By the way, if you guys were worried about some of the tack coming off this over time, and maybe the ends don't want to stay in place, you could always use a little bit of super glue or white glue and tack that on there, and that will hold that. I've actually done that before, and it will hold in place. If you're careful, you just don't obviously want to get glue all over the place. So I would just glue the top, basically the top cord, and then run your tape along there, and that should hold that in place for you. That should do just fine. So there's the long tarps. Those are all taken care of now. And I'm going to go ahead and modify a large sheet tarp now, and I'll make that work for one of these. I'll show you guys what that looks like once that's done. And a few minutes later, all the containers now have the tarps. So it looks pretty good, as you can see. Honestly, what I'm going to do at this point is I'm going to go through and I'm going to start tacking down the corners with a little bit of super glue here, and then on the 3 ribs. Just a very small amount of glue, just because I want to ensure that they're not going to lift off. As you can see, the ends especially are already starting to lift. And I obviously want to make sure that these don't, dislodge, and I have to go back and fix them and all that. It's kind of a one-job sort of deal here. So I'm just going to go in, tack all the corners down, and then what I'm going to do is I'm going to try to make a little box that I can put the container in where only the tarp is exposed. That way I can actually spray some airbrush fade on it, and that'll look real nice because it'll give me the kind of dirty faded look that I need. Some of these have a lot of rust and dirt on them too, so I'm going to try to model that next. All the containers are finished up for the most part. So the plan kind of changed a little bit. What my original plan was, I was only going to have all of these minus 6 of them, and I was going to use the red ones, the gray ones, and I made some black ones. The 9-rib version is also available at Shapeways. I don't know if these are the older version or if it was a newer one, but they don't have as many of these for sure as they do the large fleet car container here. But these ones are pretty interesting because they all have the NYC stencils on them, which is neat. But I was kind of looking at these, and I decided that I wasn't going to use these for my cars because they honestly don't really mix too well in with all the other containers. So what I'm going to do with these is probably just finish them up. I'll weather them, put tarps on them, and then I'll just sell them off. So that'll be something for you guys if you're looking for some epic containers. I'll just sell these off, put them on eBay or something later on. But they have the decals and everything, so that kind of works out. But anyways, that's what we got. So the containers are all finished, and I ended up taping the edges of the containers down, and the reason I did this is because the tape tack eventually lifts off after I did a little test. So the solution is just to take a little bit of needle, excuse me, and then you just take a little bit of CA, dip it right underneath the tarp, and then fold that little crease down, and it tacks it in place pretty nicely. And as you can see, it's nicely tightened down. It doesn't have to be perfect because the real tarps are kind of wavy anyway. There'd just be a piece of rebar that they're tied down to, so they kind of float a little bit, but it completes the illusion enough for the most part. You can see some of these I dusted a little bit too, and I'm gonna wait to do the final end decals as I talked about before, and I'm gonna wait to weather the tarps until all the model Alright, so the final assembly starts now. We got the cars weathered, the containers are pretty much done, other than a few minor decal work and some finished weathering. But what I want to show you guys is these. These are the little weights I ended up choosing for the inside of this car, and these were recommended to me by several of you YouTubers, so thank you guys. These are the little lead weights that you put on your fishing line. They're like sinkers basically, and you can select these in a number of different sizes. I got these from a guy in California for 20 bucks, pretty decent, and they have quite a bit of weight to them. So my idea here is to take one or two of these per flat and then glue them down using a little bit of this stuff here, and that should do the trick for us, right? That should work out pretty well. Glue all, preferably. I could super glue these, but I really need to just basically coat these things in glue and let them sink and weld to the floor. If I use super glue, they run the risk of drying out over time. The glue has a tendency not to want to stick to these kind of shiny, slick metal surfaces too, so they have the risk of cracking off over time if I just use super glue. So I want to use something a little bit more heavy duty to glue these down. I'm going to keep the cars like this. I'll stick one or two weights in per car, kind of in the center if I can, so it's evenly distributed, and let that dry up, and then we'll be able to flip them back over officially, and then we can start installing the containers. And that's going to pretty much be how I go about doing this. So not much to say here, but I got the weight thing figured out, and I'm finally glad about that because I was really struggling with it for a second. Here's what they look like. You can see that the profile is perfect. They fit right in there. A little bit messy on the glue, but no one's going to see that. They'll dry up for 24 hours, let them set up, and that should work perfectly. So the Berwick car has one weight per unit. The what is it? These are the Johnstown versions. These have 2 weights per car, because I was just shy 2 more weights for these, but it kind of works out because of the way I had to do the bracing inside. You see I didn't have much room to work with because I had to put braces inside these to keep the ribs straight. So it worked out just right though, and that should solve the problem. So I'm going to let these dry up and then we'll start moving on to containers. So the fun part here is that I'm going to start organizing these containers out in preparation for gluing them. These are going to be permanently installed to the models, and I'm going to arrange them, as you can see here, in ways where I'm satisfied with the look and they'll look nice on the cars. And I just tried to go for a random pattern here. So you have an all gray set here. Some of them are a little bit more faded than others, so it's kind of this cool look. You can see the variation in the containers, which is pretty cool. And then these have the mixture of the red ones in there. Same with the set in the back here. So it'll look really cool. Remember, we're not entirely done with these containers. Once they're actually on the cars, they're all glued together, we're going to have to go back and add some end decals to each of these containers. Only the ones that are exposed that are actually showing here, we'll have to just go back and add a little label here and there to the ones that are basically exposed on both ends, like that, and then the one on the end, on the bottom. So this is the arrangement I like, and I'm going to go ahead and start basically tack gluing these together with super glue, and I'm going to have to hope that the super glue holds. I'm going to try to handle these as delicately as I can, but we'll just have to see how this works out here. Hopefully they'll stick together. But the 3D engineered plastic is pretty slick, even with paint, as I found. So I guess we're just going to have to see. I mean, trial and error here. Ideally, if you really wanted these things to permanently stay together, what you would do is further drill out the holes in the little pin blocks, and then I would take and insert little pieces of like 0.05 inch wire or something like that in there, just a little long stem, and then connect them together with little pieces of wire and then glue them together. That would ensure that they can't rock back and forth on top of each other. They'd stay secure, and that would honestly work the best. But I don't really have the time to have to drill out each one of these little holes. I don't really want to damage the containers, but in hindsight that's probably what would be best if you wanted to glue these things together, is putting little pins in them. Really pretty much similar to how they would pin them together in real life, so that they don't slide around, obviously, but that's going to be the plan now. So the next thing I'm going to do, and the flat cars, the weights are all dried together. I waited 24 hours, kept them nice and flat, and I'm going to flip these all back up and then glue these together, and then I'm going to glue them to the decks of the flat cars. Here you can see they're all pretty much finished. By end decals, I mean a label like this on each one of the ends. So you can see I added those, and all the cars have those. And then I weathered up the tarps a little bit more. They could use a little bit more weathering, one of those things. I could finish them up later, but overall they look pretty good. Now there's one more thing I want to do to these, and it's actually going to be a mainline check to make sure these all work properly together around curves. I know that sounds kind of crazy. I just want to make sure that
the wheels will actually be able to go around my specific curves and radiuses on my layout, and nothing's binding together. It's something, especially on custom built cars, I really try to pay attention to. I checked these before building them, of course, too, but it always helps to go back and double check, because it's pretty important, because obviously you don't want to spend all this time and then realize, oh shit, these things can't actually run on my layout. So I'm going to do a layout double check, and we'll actually get to see how these look on the layout too. There's all the cars laid out on the railroad, and you can see they're all coupled together. So far they seem to roll pretty good. And what I'm trying to test is how they actually perform around the curves. Being that they're jointed cars, they're a little bit different. So I just want to actually make sure they roll okay. So what we're going to do is we're going to take them, and we're just going to make them go around some of these curves here real fast. And what I'm trying to find is any kind of binding right there. Hear that? So there's a little bit of binding, and it's actually kind of right somewhere in here, right in the turn, where these are binding a little bit. It doesn't sound like it's too bad though, but it doesn't maybe seem like such a huge deal, but it is something you gotta kind of be careful of, because when you build your own cars, you might forget that the wheels have to be able to move around and not interfere or hit any of your brake rigging, or interfere with like the main beam of the car, for example, which is a big issue. When I first started scratch building, I used to build these things, and I would build them too wide where the trucks would almost always swing into the side of the beam, for example, or the bolster or things like that. In this case, they seem to be performing. There is a little bit of tightness, but that also is because my curves are pretty tight too. Keep in mind, when I run these cars, they're not going to be going, you know, a scale 80 miles an hour through the layout either. I think they'll be able to do okay, but I'm actually pretty happy with that. For the most part, I'm satisfied, so no worries there. And we get to look at them on the layout, which is pretty cool. So that works out. Alright guys, we've reached the finish line. We are done with this project. All the Epic cars are finished, so they're all weathered up. The containers are done, they're all tarped and weathered up, sealed in place, decals are all installed. Each of these cars look really good, and I'm very satisfied with the results. Projects like these definitely require a lot of patience. You gotta be able to be patient and slowly work on things. You gotta plan things out carefully and not rush through stuff. That's definitely the biggest thing I'll say if you're gonna build a car like this. Just gotta be patient. And obviously it did cost a little bit of money. The cars themselves were cheap to build. It's the containers, and that's I guess the biggest downside with getting these cars, is that the containers themselves to get printed are insanely expensive. But I want to actually pass on a little message to you guys. I am working with a buddy of mine who does resin printing. He's trying to design basically a couple versions of these Epic containers, and the benefit of those is that they would be a lot cheaper, and he can probably mass produce them. It's going to probably take a little while to get them produced if we can get it. We're all trying to help him out, but we got prototype data, reference photos, everything that he needs, and he's in the process of kind of just going through and designing all this up. So we're just working on that right now, but that is something you guys, I just wanted to let you guys know about. So anyways, they're all pretty much done. And the other thing I gotta say is that they are a little bit fragile, and you gotta be careful when carrying these things. I don't want to rip the containers off, but so far I've moved it around quite a bit, even back and forth from the layout for testing, and they moved around pretty good. They're pretty sturdy for the most part. Storing them is going to be the next thing, because I'm going to probably have to get a little box for these to carefully keep them upright like this and then coupled together. But anyways, that's going to wrap the video up. I hope you guys really liked this build. I'm glad I was able to film all this for you, give you some new material, and maybe get you guys excited on maybe trying some of these scratch building techniques, some painting techniques, or weathering techniques on your own. This is really what these videos are for. You know, I don't make these just for myself, obviously. I want to put the time in and be able to kind of show you guys, and let you guys in my head a little bit to see how I actually go about making something like this, especially something like this, because this is a big project, you know, and it's a lot of work to have to build something like this. But hopefully this kind of inspires you guys to maybe try some of these techniques out, you know, experiment a little bit, see what you can come up with. So I'm going to leave you at that. Leave some comments below if you guys have more questions. Be sure to be watching this channel. I got some more build videos some upgrade videos and some more updates coming as well. So thank you for watching, guys. I'll see you in the next one. Take it easy.